Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video, I am going to present another layout design. Here is the site plan of the client's railroad area. It is actually his dining room. Off to the right of the screen is his living room. This grayed out area represents the no-go zone. The total area is 16 feet by almost 13, but we need to leave a 3-foot open area to get through to his kitchen. So at the right hand side of the plan, we have almost 10 feet that we can use. It narrows down to just over 8 on the left side. And then there is a possibility of this area in the corner, which may well be the site for an industry or something like that. It is somewhat smaller than the client's previous railroad and represented a significant design challenge, which is one of the reasons why he hired me to help him with it. Now, when I first got his list of desires for the layout, it was a bit of a tall order to fit everything in, but this is a good example of a client who was readily willing to compromise on his desires until they fitted the space he had available. I played around with a couple of different footprints, but this is the only one that had any promise. This plan shows a 30-inch wide benchwork along the south and west walls, a 3-foot aisle into the center of the room, and the remainder of the space used for, I'm going to call it a peninsula, even though it is connected up with a swing gate at the end. Now, I was sure to ask him right at the beginning whether it was acceptable for the swing gate to swing into the family room area over the no-go zone. Since it would not be permanently there, it would only be swung out for a brief moment while someone needed to walk in or out. Now, if we look at possible track alignments that I've drawn on this, the black oval represents the possibility of a helix to a second deck. Since we are limited to a maximum of a 24-inch radius, a regular circular helix would have made the lap distance too short to be able to get enough finger room between the levels with an acceptable grade, hence the reason for elongating it. So now we have a circumference which is sufficient to gain 4 inches of elevation at a 2% grade. The red line was an attempt to try to get a no-lix plan in. This route is the longest I could come up with to get between levels, and even then it's a little bit on the short side to allow both an acceptable grade and sufficient clearance between the levels. So I suggested to the client that that probably wasn't going to work and that we would have to go with a helix if he did indeed want the second deck that he felt was going to be necessary to get the railroading that he wanted into the space available. And since we're going to need mainline curves of around 24-inch radius, there is a bit of a problem with his want list because he has 2 big passenger trains, both with 8 full-length cars. And generally speaking, 30-inch radius is about the minimum for full-length passenger cars. Even in the event that he's able to tweak them to the point where he can get them to run reliably on 24-inch radius curves, they're going to look absurd doing so. So in order to get around this problem, I proposed that the upper deck would just be a basic oval with a visible town on one side and hidden staging on the other, and 30-inch minimum radius curves, and that the rest of this area and the whole lower deck would be a branch line with 24-inch radius curves where he could run smaller equipment. Now, initially he had asked for a double-track continuous main line. We did look at that briefly. We decided that not only would it be easy to fall into the trap of too much track, but the extra length necessary to put crossovers at each end would actually put a serious clamp on the possible train length. So what I've done here is proposed a second continuous run, which is part of the branch line, and this area at the end, track X, although it does give him the second loop for display running, during serious operation, one end of it would become the yard lead, and the other would probably finish as an industrial spur, and will just make it look as though the two are not connected up with each other. Now, the idea being that the main line is operated by one railroad company, and the branch line represents an independent short line, and this is their main headquarters. And there will be an interchange yard between the two. And around this time, he did mention that he also had a few short passenger cars, so he elected to put in a spur behind the passenger station. And in later plans, you'll see a crossover here to allow a train with the short passenger cars to reach the station and then operate on the branch. Now, on his previous layout, he had already started building the engine terminal. He has a 90-foot Walters turntable with a 3-store roundhouse and 1 garden track either side of it. and the lead tracks over the other side of the turntable. So I've kept that basic arrangement, and more than likely he'll be able to accommodate his existing engine terminal with relatively little change. Obviously at this point I haven't drawn in all the track, it's just an idea sketch just to see what's possible and whether or not he's going to like the concept. As we can see, the short line starts in this area, runs around the end, where there is the possibility of some additional industry, and then it would take the curved route of this switch and head down to the helix under the broad area of benchwork. Now, eagle-eyed viewers will notice that I have already dropped this aisle down to 33 inches from 36, and also reduced the width of the benchwork along the south wall. That was to allow this area to be wider, because the client asked if it was possible to have a visible scenic track running around the outside of the helix on the lower level. So here is the lower level with that arrangement. You can see I've got a backdrop around the helix with a 6-inch wide scenic section around two sides of it, so that the layout has more to look at from the outside. And the idea here is to have a couple of small towns on the branch line, and also a cut-off with a continuous circuit before heading down to staging. And the other track in here, cut-off A, is a reversing loop, with cut-off B being the continuous circuit. So he now has a total of 3 continuous loops, 2 on the upper deck and 1 on the lower. Then the plan was to head down to staging. I drew 3 different designs. Here is the first arrangement, where we have a basic staging yard with possibly a turntable release to get locomotives back on the other end of the train. Here was another arrangement I drew with stub-ended tracks and a reverted loop, so you can back trains around it to turn them instead of having to switch them. And then a third arrangement where we have double-ended staging tracks with a reversing loop beyond. Now, I was hesitant to suggest this plan to him because it now means that we have all 3 decks crossing the swing gate. So now it's going to be very critical to build it accurately enough that the tracks can line up properly on all 3 levels. And of course, needless to say, this is the arrangement that he preferred, because it is, of course, by far the simplest staging arrangement. Just run the trains through around the loop and park them ready for the next run. And there is one other advantage with this. If we go back to the previous level, this cutoff for the reversing loop is no longer required, because that function can now be done in staging, which now means that we can get rid of 2 of these extra junctions, which would possibly be difficult to hide scenically. So with the basic format of the layout decided, let's start filling in a few details and making sure that the track alignments will indeed work. Here is the main town with the curved yard ladders worked out. Now, I should probably point out that we've already discussed track and turnout choices. The client gave me a list of the turnouts he already had, and on that list there were 2 Walthers 3-way turnouts, about a dozen number 5 turnouts, half of each hand, and a few Pico turnouts, both straight and curved, which he wanted to reuse. Now, the Pico turnouts we both decided are substandard in terms of appearance, so we decided that we'll get rid of those in the staging yard. And for the visible portions of the railroad, we'd go with something a little better looking, either Walthers or hand-built fast-track turnouts. Now, to get this ladder area to work, we're clearly going to need a variety of different sizes, and that is one area where Fast Tracks wins hands down. So I set about a goal to get as many of the curved turnouts as possible to the same size, so that he could minimize the number of jigs that he needed to buy. We figured he was going to get the number 6 straight jig and 1 size of curve and build those, and then there'd be a few turnouts which you'd have to order ready built. Now, I drew a number 8 crossover in here, figuring that he's going to run passenger trains. We don't want to put a number 6 if we don't have to, but even so, I flipped the turnout at the south end to avoid any reverse curves. Oh, and he also had 1 left-hand number 10 turnout, and this industrial spur turned out to be the perfect location to use it, because the curve route now forms the mainline easement into this curve, which is better than a sharp turnout where it's necessary to put the main line through the curved route. I'm also showing the start of an elevated town area that we talked about being in front of and over the mainline staging yard, allowing those tracks to be hidden but still accessible. Obviously, much of the town will have to be removable for emergency access and, of course, maintenance of the turnouts. although with bulletproof track and careful attention to wheel and rail standards, derailments should be very, very rare indeed. Here is the next iteration of the lower level. I've started to figure out the scope of this lower town. I've now added a short passing siding in this second area. We toyed with the idea of whether this should be a double-sided scene or have a backdrop running down the middle and make it two separate scenes. And the two separate scenes won out, giving him the opportunity of having different kinds of scenery on both sides. Here is another view of the upper deck with more details drawn in. I think this is version 8 or thereabouts. It turned out that it was possible to get a fairly complex switching town in this area with several industries. And we can see that I'm developing the town a lot more, putting in 2 overpasses, well 3 if you count the one at this end, and another one that has been removed. The idea behind this area is that there used to be another bridge here, but the city council decided to remove it to avoid having to spend the money on maintaining it all the time. We figured that would just add interest. And here we have one possible location to use up a 3-way turnout, and another one here in the engine terminal. Although I later removed this one, I found a better location for it in the lower staging yard. And I didn't really like it here anyway. It just seemed very forced. With the complexity of a 3-way turnout, the prototype would only ever use one if it had to. They certainly would not elect to use one where 2 single turnouts could be used just as easily. So that is why this one works and this one doesn't. At this point, we've decided what most of the industries are going to be. If you recall, I had these 2 spurs marked as possible industries. We decided that one is going to be a caboose track, the other a rip track, repair in place. This is the only true industry track for the short line, serving a freight house and team track. And then the Class 1 main line also has its own industry to serve. And this site in this corner is really crying out for something along the lines of an industry that I showcased a few months ago, the Milan Box Company. If you want to check back to a video entitled An Industry You Can Model, I showed how this very interesting looking industry could be compressed into a space about this size. And then in the southern town, we have a fuel dealer, which allows 3 different car types on the same spur: box cars for packaged fuels, tank cars for fuel oil, and of course open hoppers on the coal trestle. We could put something along the lines of the Walters Medusa cement on the track behind it for covered hoppers. I've suggested a cold storage warehouse here, giving us a spot for reefers, and then another industry at this end that has spots for both boxcars and chemical tankers, and then the industry at the back, probably another boxcar industry. This spur behind the cement works serves as a lead track and a temporary spur in order to stash extra cars out of the way while you're switching it, just to avoid fouling the main line. I've also suggested a crossover on the mainline passing siding. Not only does it make it easier to switch this industry, but it also gives a shorter run round, just in case it's needed. It's assumed that the short line will switch the interchange yard from the east end, and the main line will switch it from the west end. But in both cases, each railroad company has one track that they can access from either end, thus allowing eastbound mainline freights to stop and exchange blocks of cars fairly easily without having to run around the entire train. And we've worked on a train length of up to about 10 feet on the main line and 7 feet on the short line. In this version, I've drawn in a little bit more details for the roads and the towns. In this corner of the room, we have the opportunity for a couple of interesting grade crossings. The one across the main line is just a simple driveway serving the team track. The public highway crosses over the industrial spurs, so that wouldn't have a gate either. The train crew would just have to do their own flagging. And there's a possibility for a fairly lengthy station approach road, and I've drawn in a couple of the Walters Merchant Road kits. Because one of the things the client asked me about was the possibility of having a few full-depth buildings where he can install interior lighting. So he gets that in this corner, right on the front edge of the railroad, where it's up in the viewer's faces. An interesting idea that we came up with for that little triangle between the 2 buildings is to make it a fast food diner. We figured a simple sign on the street corner with the name of an era-appropriate diner chain. Something like White Castle comes to mind. And then we thought about the possibility of building the front wall of the diner on the diagonal with just part of the interior, allowing the possibility of a view peering out through the diner windows across the intersection and to the rail yards beyond. Another thing he asked for was a trailer park, so I've shown that in the corner. And by this time, the mainline staging yard has increased from 5 tracks to 6. It's generally beneficial to get in as much staging as possible on any railroad design. I did at one point toy with the possibility of a crossover at this end, but it just adds complexity without really having much benefit. Here is the upper deck with all the scenic treatment filled in. Even though much of this area is urban, there's still plenty of green belt. I've suggested making this public road a tree-lined avenue. There's plenty of room for rows of trees on both sides. I haven't drawn any road access to this industry. We're assuming that that is on the opposite side and that this road just runs down the side of it. And in the prototype industry that I patterned it after, there was a public road running down the side of it with a grade crossing over 2 tracks. Although it wasn't the industrial spurs, it was the main line and a passing siding. I told you I managed to find a better location for the other 3-way turnout, so we now have 2 regular turnouts in this location instead of the 3-way. It also makes this spur serving the sand and ash track a lot more usable. I ended up dropping this crossover down from a number 8 to a number 7, and there's a few other places where I've recommended number 7 turnouts, both on the mainline crossover and on the short line ladder at this end, since there is a reverse curve in this location. Especially since he will be running mid-sized steam locomotives on this short line. He does have a couple of 282s which he wants to use. And of course, a 282 is the perfect size for the 90-foot turntable. I kept the number 6 ladder at this end of the interchange yard. If he does want to switch this with a large steam locomotive, he can get around the problem by just blocking the train so that the portion of the train that he's switching out is a few cars back, thus giving a handle long enough to get over the reverse curve so that the locomotive doesn't have to negotiate it. Another way to avoid it would be to go to a completely custom turnout at this point. It would be possible to build a number 7 or 8 curved turnout into the easement. Here is the lower level completed. I added 1 extra industry at this town. We've got local station stops at both towns, a significant sized manufacturing industry. Note that there are 2 hidden tracks along the back running under the scenery and through this building, and this road will need to have a slight upgrade. It'll need to gain about 1.5 inches to cross over the rear track at this point. We talked about the possibility of making this industry in this corner a sawmill. We figured that the logs will come up from staging, be dropped at the sawmill, and then boxcars or flat cars full of cut lumber will continue up to the interchange with the Class 1 railroad. I finished this isolated spur as a pulpwood loading area because pulpwood loads are really cool. The client specifically asked for a stock pen, and there was room for another freight house with an end loader and a team track on the other spur. I also showed 2 places where there is space for tall trestles, one in this front corner and one at the end of the aisle. Doesn't need both of them. There's just 2 places where they might go if he is desirous of such a feature. On multi-deck layouts, finding space for tall bridges can be troublesome. There's another one on the swing gate, and here there is an option. I've shown this one as a truss with approach trestles. If he wants the line down to the staging to reappear, then this will be a fairly tall valley. Although the lower track is far enough below at this point that this can still be a shallow river valley with the lower track remaining hidden below it. So there are a couple of choices there. Here is a version with the elevations drawn in. Now these are not elevations from floor level, they are from datum level, i.e. from the lower staging. The main staging yard below this town is 0. I was able to get a 16-inch separation between the staging yard and the level above using 2% grades. It doesn't have to be that high. It may well be that the client wants to cut it down to about 14 inches by reducing those grades. and allow him more leeway as to where the upper deck goes. Here is the staging level with the elevations drawn in, showing the reversing loop and the staging yard at 0. The vertical curve will have to start in the ladder, which is no big problem as long as it is done very carefully and gradually. If he doesn't start the vertical curve for the grade until after the end of the ladder, there is insufficient space to get over the top of the reversing loop without either going above a 2% grade or dropping the reverse loop below 0, which of course adds complexity in this area, which we don't really want, since the swing gate is already going to be complicated enough. I haven't bothered to show the upper deck with elevations drawn in because there's only one grade on that level. The 2% grade comes all the way out from the helix around this area to this turnout. And this route here just about gives enough clearance to dive behind the engine terminal and underneath the yard. At the expense of a slight extra complexity, it would be better if this town were placed half an inch below the rest of this level. There's plenty of room for a short grade in here and another one here, in both cases less than 1%. That would allow a little more leeway on this track approaching the helix. And structurally, I imagine this area of the benchwork being framed slightly narrow and then this grade down being cantilevered off the outside of the frame, instead of having to have the frame underneath it, where it is going to reduce the viewing distance between decks. Okay, now I have one other view to show you. Here is the staging level. I just showed you that one. At this point, the client asked if it was possible to add a continuous circuit in on this level so that he can run in loops before he builds the next level. And that is indeed entirely feasible. We just need an extra curve turnout and this end hooking up with the back of the reversing loop. And we can also see that here's the other location where I used up his second three-way turnout. Now I'm going to leave it here. Hope you've enjoyed this layout presentation, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.